This is Becoming Inclusive from the Kaleidoscope Group, where we're thinking differently about diversity, equity, and inclusion for more empowered people at work. We're committed to real change, and that begins with real conversations. Welcome in.
I'm Reggie Ponder, and welcome to another episode of Becoming Inclusive. You know, it's a journey, and every week we try to have my co-host Kat on. Sometimes she does it by herself because she leaves me out. But I like to welcome my co-host Catherine Potts. Hey, Catherine, how are you?
Hey, I'm good. Happy to be here with you, Reggie.
I am too, because, you know, it's so funny as we talk about becoming inclusive. You and I have so many conversations offline, and you told me that you really wanted to have this person on to talk about, to just chat with. And so I'm happy to have Hanlie Van Wyck. She is a global engagement leader and a subject matter expert. And welcome, Hanlie.
Thank you very much. I'm delighted to be here.
So some of the discussions that we have, and we have all these different discussions and what we're hearing people talk about out in the marketplace. And one of them, Hanlie, you talked about this thing of people just kind of want to do stuff, but you really put to this whole issue about planning the stuff that we want to do, not just going out there and just saying, okay, we've done it. And we're not talking about people who are trying to check a box. We're talking about people who are probably passionate about this work, who have goals and want to do stuff and make change. But you have a different perspective on this as opposed to just trying to make change, trying to plan change. Kind of put that in perspective for us.
Absolutely. One of the things we've been noticing, especially with our global clients, and I'm sure some of our local clients as well, is that there's often this drive to get stuck into doing things. Like, just tell me what to do and I'll do it. Or here are 50 initiatives that we have and that we're planning and that we're doing. And it's wonderful to see that kind of drive and passion for DE&I and for the subject matter. The problem with that is sometimes if it's not done in a very thoughtful and conscious way, it misses the point and the impact of it might diminish as a result. And so one of the things that I always try to bring, other than strategy, to say we have to have activities within a strategy with measures, etc., is also think about the human component, which is there's a lot of behavior change and habit formation that is required of people when we're talking about DE&I. And that is not a simple thing to do. It is quite complex. And if we step over that and don't think consciously about designing for that behavior change, it might just slip through the cracks.
And I want to rewind too, because that note that you made around impact, the impact being so important is because like the ultimate goal is sustainable change, not just a short-lived thing. So I think it's important to highlight that as well.
And I've seen, before you say something on that, Hanlie, I've seen studies that really talk about how there's so many people out there doing this change management, so to speak, but the results for that are not as robust as the beginnings of that.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. And it often is because the behavioral change piece is not necessarily neglected, but it's not seen as something that requires practice and transition into a different kind of culture. Because your culture is really just a collection of the behaviors of people who work in your company, right? And so if you want to create a culture, you have to think carefully about the behaviors that underpins that culture. And when it comes to change management, very often they are strongly focused on systems, rules, regulations, policies, procedures, business models, extremely important, but not sufficient. When it comes to looking at the social context and how each individual plays into that and what they bring. And
so at the point in which you were talking about that is not sufficient. It's necessary. The organizational stuff is necessary, but it's not sufficient. And you talk about this because what I'm getting is that companies miss that human component, if you will.
Absolutely. And the human component that they miss is that group and individual choices that people make to behave in a certain way, the things that they believe, how they contage each other with their behavior, because behavior is very contagious. For example, there's been lots of research being done just on rudeness. If someone is rude in the organization, it kind of triggers this contagion piece. So I think that's something very interesting to consider is how do you go about helping people to change their behavior and form new habits?
That, and with the consideration, depending on your tenure at the company, it can be difficult. It's different if you've only been at the company, well, if you're just walking in the door, or you've been there a couple years. But if you've been there, 10, 20 years, and now all of a sudden everything is changing, a company can't take the approach of either like you get on board or you're out. These are people that are used to something that was the norm, but now it's not. So, how do we mitigate that and leave space for those who it may not be as easy for them to just, transition? Because not the other part of it too, I'm sure you run into, not everybody is ready.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And for that, it's important to look at people's general competency around the subject matter. Not everyone knows exactly how to behave or behave differently or know everything they need to know. For example, I think a lot of the LGBTQ issues that come up, people just don't know. So, make space for that, have grace for that. Then there's the confidence piece. Maybe I've read something or I've learned something, but I'm not quite confident in how I'm going to speak about this or what I'm going to do. Then the other piece is the motivation. What are my drivers? Why is this important for me? Why is this important for the company? And then the piece that speaks really to this practice and transition of culture and how change works is we're all going to make mistakes. We're all going to experience barriers and have temptations that wants to pull us back into our old behaviors. And that's perfectly natural. How do we help people overcome those barriers and resist those temptations as they're trying to practice these new behaviors and form new habits?
I really love this, and I was going to bring up this whole issue of the LGBTQ community is because for me, I have the last 10 years I have not been using the terms they and them, and so now when you talk about transition, I'm not being dismissive or trying to be rude or mean, but it is a transition for me to get there. And I love it that the LGBTQ people in my life give me grace for that transition. And that I'm understanding that I might need to speed it up a little bit here, but I am really working on trying to do that. So I love that is a real tangible example of how we're human. So there is a transition, and to be able to understand that as opposed to, okay, we just came up with some new terms. You need to have them today, and we need to be ready to rock and roll.
Absolutely. And that would speak to what I call the context of self. So that there's a change that you need to make. You're a little bit uncertain. You're lucky enough to have friends around you that says, look, we'll help you and we'll correct you as you go along and we'll guide you. This is okay. Make the mistakes. It's not a big deal. You have a safe space. But then as you transition in a company, in the context of the company or the social networks in which you work within the company, also to train there and to say, hey, I learned something new today. Let me share with you how with this new information that I have that I'm practicing. And so you begin to contage and spread that kind of behavior and that habit. Then it's important also for the systems to be matched to that. So then we speak about, are the rules, regulations, and policies also in line with saying, be very careful how you address somebody. Here's perhaps some procedures that you could follow or something that you can read to help you. And then finally, there's a very interesting piece, and I call it the context of space or situation or surroundings. Very often we forget that our surroundings are also encouraging certain behaviors. And when you're trying to learn something new, it might be helpful to have a poster up that says, do it this way, in places where people might pause, like at an elevator, or to make sure that the bathrooms display that you as a company are really trying to incorporate, differences and be very inclusive by changing the way that the bathrooms work, for example. So all those things will help these behaviors and help you as an individual then practice those behaviors, and hopefully other people in the organization as well.
Yeah, I was going to ask, like, kind of what sort of supplemental things can we do, right? Because obviously, if we're working on this much bigger journey with a company or a client, what are those small things we can do? So I'm glad you hit on that, because some people need that extra, reminder. They need that extra practice. It's not that we can spend, all day, right, going over how to teach someone, what pronoun to use, but that I think, offering that extra help will also help people become more open-minded, because they don't feel that pressure of it's expected of me right this second. People trying to lead me to being better.
And I absolutely agree. And I have a philosophy that says people don't do things in a specific way either because they don't know how to do it or they don't care. So, and in both cases, you can address that and say, all right, if you don't know how, we can work that. And if you don't care, let's have a conversation about why you don't care. And
And for you, Hanlie, do you put in the don't care category that I don't like it? Because I believe there's a category of I don't like it. So those are the people that I call the resistors, but you might just put that in the I don't care area. I'm not sure.
It could be I don't care. I think it also can sometimes be I don't know how, but I'm too scared to ask.
I'm going to say that for fear.
Mm-hmm. And so either way, it's worth a conversation to say, okay, let me try and understand where you're coming from. And, is there a way to either change your mind about that or help you to know how or overcome your fear of that? Either way, I think it's important to always approach these subjects with as much empathy and kindness and openness as you can to elicit those conversations. And sure, if someone comes back and it's a hard no, please don't talk to me about it, I'm not interested, you would leave it alone. But I would say that the majority of the people that we are interacting with are very keen to make some of these changes, and this might be helpful for them.
You're also a point around being careful, because if you were to shove something down people's throat a certain way, then you could just have a bunch of people retracting. And that's kind of, you got to think about that too. But then an outcome as well as being inclusive and allowing those conversations can also inspire, right? Another way you have to pivot what your game plan actually is because of a perspective that wasn't considered, when making decisions about what do we want the culture to look like now.
Absolutely. I agree.
When we talk about change and this whole issue of transition is so interesting to me, because I hadn't heard people really talk about that part, because we just put it in there, and again, it doesn't seem like we have the grace or the time to transition. And companies are trying to move quickly, as quick as possible. So I do think they kind of overlook that. But change for me comes across as innovation. So when we talk about change and we talk about innovation, I've seen a lot of discussion that, yes, we try to change systems and all of that. But I think there was an article that you had us look at that really innovations should start from a management perspective, is that we start looking at how do we look at innovation from a people perspective as opposed to a systems perspective. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Sure. And I think that the people perspective is as important, if not more important, than the systems perspective. But if you consider that in the popular media, they say it takes 21 or 28 days to change your habits, right? Now, that might be true for very easy things to do. But if you look at the research, it says that it takes on average 66 days to change a habit. And with complex behaviors, it can take up to 250 days. So just considering that, you begin to see how much you have to stay engaged with people, continuously remind them, continuously offer points of practice, continuously help them overcome any barriers that might pop up to them, like fear or temptations that says, well, it's just too difficult, I'm just going to, never mind, okay? Or don't talk to me about it. So how do we help them resist that temptation? But it's really important to continuously focus on that human piece and understand that what we are trying to do has to do with human beings, and the majority of the impact that we're going to have over a 2 or 3 year period comes from those changes. And that's why it's so important to invest the time in that and to make sure that it's carefully crafted.
It really reminds me of like sort of the health and wellness market, right? Because none of those are, I mean, that's a clear example of a market where constantly are telling people, clients, this is going to take months. This is going to take weeks. We're going to set you up with reminders. We're going to make you meal kits. We're going to do all this stuff. It takes so long, and then they do the 3 months, 6 months, 12 months. So it's like, that's already, that infrastructure is used for people all the time, health and wellness every day. So it's like, okay, how do we now take that sort of mindset, but put it into just like your everyday corporations and businesses? Because what do you want to say, Reggie? I see.
So, Kat, I really, really love what you're saying. Here's my issue. I was just watching something that said that I could lose 20 pounds in 7 days. That's the one I want. I don't want the one you're talking about. I want the 7 days. But I think what you and Hanlie are trying to say to me is that, that's probably not going to work.
Not sustainable change.
Not for long-term cultural change within the organization. Yes, there are things that you can do that you can quickly change. So let's use your languaging example, right? So in order to know to get used to using the phrase them or whatever people want to be called, it might take you a couple of weeks just to get used to it. When someone's just reminding you, no, you've got to say it that way. No, you've got to say it that way. So that could be a quicker change. So some changes will come sooner than others. But just doing that, for example, is not going to change the culture of an organization. It may be the beginning, or it may be a drop in the bucket of, and we need to get more people to do that and be in that conversation as well. So I think it's important to notice that some things can be quick wins and quick changes, but habit formation itself, I think, takes time, and it's not a static thing. There's very many times in our lives, and I love the example that you used of wellness, Kat, where, you're very good, you're going to the gym, or you're doing your running or your stretching or your yoga for a little while, and then it's good for 3 months, and then, oh my goodness, something changes and oops, it's all gone, right? And then you're like, oh, I got to start again. That's okay. And that's the same with any behavior. So, you just have to figure out how to start again. And a lot of that has to be built in to say, it's okay if it doesn't happen for a little while, let's just get back on track again and keep moving. The other point that's interesting in short-term behavior change is the issue of incentives, and there's a lot of controversy around this. One of the things that I've learned over time is that it's really good to get people to engage and initiate and incentivize those beginning actions, but you can't continuously want to incentivize behavior that should be drawn into a deeper level of the organization. So, okay, pay them something or find a way to measure some of those initial changes to get people going, but don't expect it to keep them going, if that makes sense.
No,
if you use the right pronouns, because then you get back from the trip and you're probably not thinking about the pronouns anymore.
But that makes sense because as a father, we did some of that rewarding for good grades, but at a certain time, at a certain point, there needs to be some self-motivation for those grades. Now, when we kind of pull back from that, they're like, well, wait a minute. I used to get a little extra something for those good grades, but at some point in time, it has to mean something to you. And I think it kind of goes back to this piece where you said that they might not know how or they don't care. Mm-hmm. And at some point, I wanted my kids to care, not just care about the incentive, but care about the issue, care about the class, care about the thing that we're talking about. And I think that what that does is that brings us back to this whole thing about the human piece to all of this change that we're talking about. Mm-hmm. And I heard this phrase, Hanlie, called human forward. Being human forward as opposed to process forward, as opposed to procedure forward or organizational forward. And I know we've talked about that, but can you speak just a little bit more to that?
I think it speaks to that why, right? To really understand and connect with the reasons why this is happening in the company. So if we're trying to make change in an organization and we are expecting certain behaviors, it's important to articulate why this is important and how it connects to the business objectives. Then the human forward piece comes in. How do you fit into it as an employee of this company? How do you show up as a leader? What are your motivations, your beliefs, your filters? What is your level of self-awareness? Because as consultants, we can come into a company and give them all the right tools and strategies, but if it's not lived from within the company and leaders aren't leading that particular initiative and being human forward and understanding that they are the role models for being human forward, it's going to be very difficult to make that change evidenced in the culture of the organization a year from now, 2 years from now, 3 years from now.
Kat, before you jump in, because I can see it, but this human forward thing is scary. And the reason it's scary is because it's taking it's diminishing the processes, procedures, things that we put in place and saying, hey, we're recognizing that you're human. And when we start to recognize that people are human, there's so much variability in that. There's so much room to move that it's scary for an organization, because Hanlie is going to act one way to it, Reggie's going to react one way to it, and Kat is going to react another way to it. And that's going to cause me some organizational angst.
Mm-hmm. Well, I'm just going to say, I imagine too, the angst, I think, comes from questioning, how do we create standards that everyone's going to follow if we are sort of possibly over-conscious of each individual?
Absolutely. And I think that's where processes, procedures, policies, all the systems things are there to support the human and to help humans say, oh, okay, I'm uncertain about this, or I have one particular view and you have another view, but our process is this, or our policy is that. And so they should exist to support the human beings that are in the company, trying to make those behaviors, trying to, bringing their passion to make these changes and start these initiatives and be in action about it.
Oh, I love that. I could just end right there, because the way you punctuate that point really, really works for me. And it says to me, let's stop treating employees like commodities. Mm-hmm. Let's stop saying, okay, if you perform well, we keep you. If you don't perform well, we don't keep you. But that we really look at our employees. I like some companies, they don't even call them employees. They call them partners, or they call them I know one company calls them investors, because excuse me, they're all investing in the health and wealth of the company.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. And I think that is the shift that needs to be made, because human beings are more complex. They're tricky. They show up one way one day and another way the next day, and that's okay. And we know that. We also know that people are very resilient. We deal with change our entire lives. You go to school, you leave school, you go to university or college, right? There's a change. People in your life might leave or die. That's another change. You change jobs the whole time. You get married. You have children. You are constantly, as a human being, having to deal with change. And so the capacity is there. It's for the organization just to design it in such a way that you can bring that capacity and that it supports that. And that's, again, back to some of the processes or the spaces or the social structures that you create that will help you in those natural transitions as we go through life. And I think that it will come to play in the DE&I space very well if that's well thought through.
Yeah, the one thing I always say to people is change is the only consistent thing in this life.
and the thing that I say that comes after that is that change is scary.
It can be.
because you don't know what's on the other end of that change. So now that I have to learn new language to talk to my LGBTQ people, will I be offensive? But what I also say, Kat, is that change is scary. And so I know it's constant, but here I am, I'm thinking, am I saying it right? Do I have the right language? Will I offend people? So all of those things make it so scary for individuals. I'm not saying that it's right that it's scary. I'm just saying that we're saying being human forward is true that it's going to be scary.
No, and I agree. It can definitely be scary, but I think this is where it's the organization's role and maybe even responsibility to make sure that they create or design a space in which you can practice and fail and learn and build confidence, so that within 3 months you feel very confident that you can have conversations and know how to use a pronoun, for example. And so I think that's the design element that plays in it and is quite important when it comes to wanting to encourage people to behave in a different way.
Hanlie, I really love that, because as we were talking a little more specific from an LGBTQ perspective, but when we look at DE&I in holistically, people are like, the words are scary. Diversity, equity, inclusion. Sometimes, as to what you were saying, people don't even know what they mean, but they have a meaning in their head. So just bringing the topic to the table is scary.
And absolutely. And I think, again, that is where building competence and confidence and really being aware of your motivations becomes really important. And again, to allow people to fail, to say, yes, there are going to be temptations. Yes, you are going to experience barriers. Yes, just like exercise, you're going to get it right sometimes and then not. Here's how you can get back on track again. Here's how to have a difficult conversation when you've made a mistake, because you will make a mistake and that's okay. Here are the tools to deal with that and to say, whatever, I'm sorry, or this is how we can take this conversation forward. Those are as I said earlier, those are where the processes, the policies and procedures can support the humans in being able to behave and transition their behaviors into something that is more of a habit, so that a year later you show up slightly differently because your behaviors have been adapted successfully. And the culture will then begin to shift and change as a result of that.
Change takes a long time. I mean, change just takes a long time. Because we're very results-oriented society. I mean, especially in the U.S. I don't want to speak a blanket statement over the whole world, but at least, I know for growing up here, we're just so output-oriented. We want to see success right now, yesterday. So that patience is important.
No, I really love that. Look, Hanlie, we need to have you back, obviously, because there's some more stuff to talk about. I want to talk to you about how our technology is way ahead of our management systems and just so many other things. So we will absolutely have you back. What you did for me today is there are 2 points that I take away from this. Mm-hmm. And before I say that point, well, maybe there's 3. The 3 points that I take away are that you're saying that we should be coached, not canceled. Mm-hmm. That's that grace thing. That's that understanding that the human element is there to play. But you're also telling me that change is dynamic. It's always happening. You gave us the example of just our lives. You go to college, you get married, you buy a home, but things are always changing. And then for me, probably the most important piece that I'll take away is this whole thing about design for it. Design for change. Don't just let it happen. It's going to happen, but don't let change just occur. Prepare for that change. Is there anything I missed here?
No, I absolutely agree. I think consciously designing for change, for creating the culture that you really want, specifically when it comes to DE&I think is absolutely key to the work that we do.
I'm Reggie Ponder, and this is Becoming Inclusive. That is Hanlie van Wyck, and that is Catherine Potts. We will see you again on our next episode of Becoming Inclusive. Thanks for joining us. See you next time.
Thanks for joining us, and a special thanks to our subscribers. Consider becoming one today. Becoming Inclusive is presented by the Kaleidoscope Group, your full-service diversity, equity, and inclusion partner serving clients worldwide. Learn more and continue the conversation at kgdiversity.com.